Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to bring you part 2 of my review of the little Tamron 24mm F2.8 DI3 made for mirrorless OSD, which stands for Optimized Silent Drive, which is the focus system, and then it's M1-2, which means that it has 1 to 2 macro capabilities. And so in the first part of our review, we take a look at the build, the design, the features that are here. We also took a detailed look at that OSD, Optimized Silent Drive focus motor, and how it performs both in focus accuracy and focus speed, and then also the sound and quality of focus for both stills and video. And so I would recommend that you start by taking a look at that episode if you haven't already. Now today, one of my chief intentions is to answer a question that is raised by the fact that Tamron not long ago also released a very popular 17 to 28mm f2.8 RXD zoom lens, wide-angle zoom lens for Sony as well. And so the question becomes, since they've essentially created the top competitor for their own lens, in that this lens covers 24mm with the same maximum aperture as the prime. So why would one consider purchasing the prime instead of the zoom? We're going to take a look at maybe a few of those reasons today, but we're going to start off by taking a look at the actual image quality, along with doing some comparisons, direct comparisons between these two lenses, and so that you can get a sense of, where each shines when compared to the other. Let's jump in and let's take a look. So let's start by taking a look at distortion and vignette. Now, first note is that at close focus distances like this particular test is shot at, it's going to exaggerate any kind of existing barrel distortion. And so, it's good news in that it does emphasize what's there, and so that's helpful for us to see that there is some obvious barrel distortion here. The also good news is that in most focus distances, it's not going to be nearly this pronounced. Now on the right side here, we have a manual correction that I did. I just added a plus 13 into the distortion value, and so you can see it is a nicely linear distortion. So we actually end up with actually very well corrected lines. I also added in about a third stop of a vignette correction in the edge on the right side, and then move the midpoint about 2/3 of the way, and so you can see it's a fairly easy end result to fix. Now to give you an idea of how JPEGs are going to look, this is the exact same shot. This is the RAW on the left, the JPEG on the right. So both JPEG files along with video is going to be corrected in a similar fashion. So what you can see here is that we actually end up with a really clean, even result here. So it's instructive to compare with the 17 to 28mm set at 24mm, both at f2.8. And so unsurprisingly here, we are going to see that there is certainly less distortion here. This is basically, about midway through the focus range here or the zoom range, I should say. And at the same time, there's also probably a hair less vignette as well. And if we zoom in here and we look at this box here, we can see that it is a little less magnified on the prime than what it is on the zoom. So what that tells us is that the prime is a little bit wider here in the framing, at least after correction. So I'm going to compare now the two shots. This is my own corrections of the raw images, and so to try to get as close to an apples to apples comparison. And so what we can see is in the center of the frame, the zoom has probably a little bit more sharpness and contrast. It's not by a large margin, but if you look like in this area, you can definitely see there's better micro contrast from the zoom lens. If you move out to the edge of the frame, however, even mid-frame, you can see that the advantage starts to shift over towards the prime lens. And if you move into the corners, that is particularly true, where there is obviously more contrast and resolution on the prime than there is on the corners of the zoom lens. And so we can definitely see that there is some advantage for it there. What we can also see, just taking a quick look around, is that the prime is nicely centered with good even performance across all sides. Now taking a look at a few real world shots, even at f2.8, what we can see is that we have nice looking color and contrast here, and we can see as we move off towards the edge of the frame that our detail holds up. And so we can see again here on this side that detail looks nice and clean, contrast looks good, no obvious chromatic aberrations that are marring the image even in these high contrast zones, the branches going into against a white sky. Once again here, even at wide open f2.8, we can see that detail has held up here, and we have nice, it's definitely usable wide open at f2.8. Now if we can compare f4 to f2.8, we can see that we have more even illumination across the frame. Looking in the center of the frame, we can see there's a bit of improvement particularly in the contrast, in that you can see the brighter areas look brighter, darker areas retain similar darkness. So a little bit more apparent resolution. Moving off here towards the edge of the frame, at mid-frame, we can see again better contrast, a little bit better resolution, but it's mostly a contrast improvement. And let's take a look at one of the corners here, and we can see kind of the same thing, maybe a little bit more uptick in resolution, but it's mostly improvements to contrast. What we also see is no evidence of lateral chromatic aberrations along these edges here where it would show up. Now if we can compare the prime to the zoom being on the right, it's kind of the same pattern as before in that the center contrast and resolution favors the zoom lens. If we move off towards the edges, however, we see the opposite to be true, and even mid-frame and up into the corners, we can see an obvious difference in resolution from the prime lens that looks just a lot cleaner, much more even performance. So if we move on to f5.6, we see that the prime is now more similar to the zoom lens in the center of the frame, and delivering a strong performance there. But it still holds the edges, and basically at all tested apertures, it holds the edges mid-frame and off into the corners. They never get as sharp on the zoom lens as they do here on the prime. Now if we can compare, this is on a Sony a7R Mark III, so 42 megapixels. If we compare f22, which is minimum aperture, to maximum aperture f2.8, we can see there's definitely more contrast and detail at f2.8 than there is at f22, and that's due to diffraction on the image on the right. Here's a different angle of the same scene. You can see the snow falling as I'm taking the shot. But despite that kind of obscuring texture somewhat, we've got very nice detail and a good looking end result. Here's another scene at f5.6, and so we can see, again, snow falling. It's kind of a theme in my life at the moment, but we can see really good contrast, good detail, and again, in these transition areas from dark branches to either white snow or the background to the sky, we can see that there is no kind of bleeding, no fringing, and so it looks really, really good. Resolution, colors, everything looks quite nice. Now here's a couple of images to show off how nice the color can be. I really liked this particular shot, just the way that the morning light starting to break through was coming through into this scene, and so you can see the colors look really, really nice. Here too, the light starting to skim into these trees, and so we can see there's nice detail in the trees and good color rendition. Everything looks nice and crisp here. I'm happy with these results. Another interesting scene here, and so you can see similar kind of situation, snow falling, but nice crisp detail throughout the image, and of course for being such a compact lens, this is really, really nice image quality. Now, of course, this is more than just a landscape lens. However, it does have that 1:2 macro capability. And in fact, here, shot on APS-C, we actually have 1:1 reproduction here. And so you can see we have got a tremendous amount of magnification. This goes to show you how close you can actually get in APS-C mode. Now you're very, very close to the subject here, but you can see that detail here, even at this minimum focus, is actually quite good. This is an image that I really like, and it shows that even here at this kind of detailed distance, that you can see that resolution looks good, and also chromatic aberrations are well controlled. And so and the bokeh actually looks pretty decent in this image, and so I'm quite happy with the overall look of the image. Here's another example of what you can do in getting down close to something. And so, you know, it doesn't have a huge maximum aperture, and so it's not going to obliterate a background. But what we can see is that it renders details really nicely. And again, good chromatic aberration control allows you a lot of flexibility in shooting these type of shots. So let's drill down a little bit more on that chromatic aberration and fringing. And so here I've shot a lot of light through this and I know that it shows up, you know, any kind of fringing. So what we can see ahead of the plane of focus is almost no purple fringing, and so that's really well controlled. We can see a little tiny bit of green fringing, and looking towards the bokeh region, tiny bits of that, but this is actually quite a well-controlled result. And the byproduct of that is you can see really nice looking detail and contrast on these various things that are in the plane of focus. Here's another look at how the kind of bokeh looks, and then also you can see, zooming in here, it allows you, even at f2.8, to have really nice detail and contrast in this. And as you look moving out of the plane of focus, it's not being marred by any chromatic aberrations. There's nothing here to correct any of that either. So this shows you the bokeh geometry, and so, you know, very nice in the center of the frame, you know, clean circles, not too bad of an inner line, but there is some, you can see just general busyness in the bokeh circles, but this isn't a bad result here. You can see there is going to be some geometric deformation, you know, lemon kind of shape here, looking at the very edges of the frame. So that's f2.8. If we stop down to f4, we can see the circle shapes extend further, although they're still not geometrically perfect. And then at f5.6, you know, we got a much more consistent shapes across the frame, but you can also start to see the 7 aperture blades there. And so I wouldn't say that you ever have pure circles across the frame at any aperture. Now finally, one really great strength of this lens is flare resistance. And so whether or not you can actually see a little bit because of a few of the light shafts coming off the f11. The sun is actually right here in the frame. So beyond this little tiny bit of ghosting here on the f11 image, you really can't hardly see any ghosting or veiling in the image. Contrast is held up well, and even when shooting video and going back and forth, I find flare resistance to be very good. So the B-bar coatings have done their job. So let's take a quick look at Coma performance as a part of this evaluation. So not fantastic conditions. This time of year is really not a great one for astro where I live. So I had to contend with obviously a very bright moon in the frame, but it's the only non-cloudy night that I've had in a long time. But what we're looking for is to see if we get a little bit of the wings growing. And so we can see that in a few of these star points, there is the ever so slight little bit of coma, but nothing very strongly pronounced. And so overall, this really isn't a bad performance. And so this is a lens you could use for coma. It's not perfect. And I would fault, if I'm going to fault it anywhere, I would say that in the center of the frame, star points aren't quite as crisp as what I would like to see. That we see just the slightest bit of coma even in the center of the frame, but it doesn't get worse towards the edges of the frame. And so as you can see, you know, the synopsis is that both of these lenses are very competent. In the 17 to 28 millimeter, very similar to what I saw when I compared it to the Sigma 14 to 24 millimeter f2.8 art for Sony FE, is that this lens, 17 to 28 millimeters, is really fantastic in the center of the frame. Great punch, great color, great contrast, and great resolution. It's not as good at the edges of the frame, however. And the same we saw a kind of pattern with the 24 millimeter in that, you know, more like the Sigma, it was actually a hair behind the 17 to 28 in the center of the frame, center maybe, you know, third to half of the frame. As you move out towards the edges of the frame, however, at all tested apertures, it was actually the prime that was sharper and definitely had better sharpness and contrast in the corners. Now, we also saw that this has a fair amount of distortion, but we also saw that fortunately it's linear in nature and not all that hard to correct. We also saw that both the in-camera profile for JPEGs and for video actually does a great job of correcting for it. So at the end of the day, if you're shooting JPEGs or video, not a big deal. Unfortunately, at this stage, at least in Lightroom, I don't have a profile yet, and surprisingly, one hasn't shown up for this lens yet either, even though it was released months ago. And so when you're shooting RAWs, you have, a little bit more work ahead of you. You can create your own custom profile, which is not hard to do because it is linear, but I would prefer to see an actual official profile created for it. But let's take a look at how this lens performs for actually getting video footage, how it works on a gimbal. We'll jump into a section about that. So in our last episode, we highlighted how that the not quite silent nature of the OSD drive makes this lens a little bit imperfect in some situations where you're doing a focus pull. At the same time, however, its small compact size and also its great focal length makes it a really natural lens to use for video work. When used on a gimbal, for example, it's a great focal length in either the 24mm or, closer to 36mm when using Super 35. And so as you can see from this footage, it works really nicely on a gimbal, and particularly if you're recording your audio separately, you're not going to have any kind of issue with that clicking noise. And you can see here that while there is a little bit of stepping in these focus pulls, they're otherwise quite good. So even when using the onboard microphone, when you have environmental sounds, like when you're working on a gimbal, in these scenes, you're mostly going to hear the crunching of my boots in the snow. You're going to hear some environmental sounds. But because you're not doing necessarily major focus pulls, you're not really hearing much of that clicking of the focus taking place. And so in certain situations, even when recording onboard audio, you're not going to have a major issue. Now, what you can see on a very positive fashion here is that our footage looks nice and crisp. As we saw earlier in this review, actually any kind of distortion there is being corrected, and vignette is being corrected in camera by the in-camera profile when you have it enabled. And so that enables your footage to just look nice and clean. And as you can see, it is a great natural focal length when doing gimbal type work, particularly this kind of work where you're moving. It's going to be good for vlogging as well. And so as you can see, the picture in this episode is a little bit more rosy than what it was in the first episode, in that while there's a lot of good things that were there, I did have some criticisms when it came to the nature of the OSD focus motor, and I think that still remains my chief criticism here. Sure, I mean, I would like to see a little bit more on here in terms of features, maybe at least an AF/MF switch, but I didn't expect it because that hasn't been on any of Tamron's FE lenses so far, and frankly, it's not entirely necessary. It's a nice bonus, but not necessarily, a must-have when it comes to mirrorless design. And so they've they've purposed to go for something simple, and they've cut cost in that area, but they have included important things like weather sealing, which is nice to have. The lens itself and its design is nothing particularly special, but I think it will hold up just fine and will be durable in the way that a lot of other lenses designed kind of like this have been. The focus ring is okay. It's not exceptional, but it will get the job done. My only criticism there is that sometimes I feel like I make minor focus changes and nothing happens, and then I reach another point just a little bit further and I'll see a focus change. So it's not always as linear maybe as what I would like to see in its performance. But at the end of the day, this lens does obviously offer up some very strong image quality. It's very sharp at all tested apertures and very consistently sharp across the frame. It exhibits good color performance, good flare resistance, good control of chromatic aberrations, both longitudinal and lateral. And so, I mean, it ticks off most of the boxes. The Coma performance is good. It's not the best that I've seen, but it's good and usable for that. And so really at the end of the day, there are a lot of positives that are there. So why would you choose this over the zoom lens? Well, of course, the first and most obvious for a lot of people would be price. And if you're going to mostly shoot at 24mm, you don't necessarily need to buy a zoom lens that costs over twice as much when you can get this for $349, and it will serve the 24mm focal length very, very well. And if you're a video shooter, you can get both 24mm and 36mm for video footage. And of course, you can also shoot it in APS-C mode. And by the way, this lens actually performs well on on crop cameras, and we saw that the benefit there is that reproduction ratio, because of the crop factor, actually kind of doubles in real life actuality, which allows you to get in very, very close, and so that becomes very useful. So that leads us to the second reason why you would maybe choose this lens over the zoom lens, and that is that it has a very unique maximum magnification. And even on full frame, that 0.50 times or 1:2 life-size reproduction is very, very special and very useful. However, just be careful with this. With a wider focal length like this, there's a reason why most macros are not 24 millimeters. And that is because if you're getting very close to something, if it's not centered in the frame, you can definitely get some perspective distortion, some exaggeration because of the physics of the focal length. And so it's useful to have, and I'm really glad to have it. To me, it's what made this lens interesting. But at the same time, you do have to be careful in the way that you use it if you want to get the kind of results that you want. But the other advantage there is that a wider angle of view does give you a different framing perspective, and it might be more useful for things like food photography, maybe product photography where you're working in a tighter space and still want to get fairly close. And so there certainly are some applications for that. And I have no reservations, obviously, when it comes to the image quality. Even close-up performance is really quite good. At the end of the day, I think that, I look at this lens and then Sigma's, small and cheaper prime, the 45mm F2.8 that I reviewed not long ago. And in some ways, I wish that I could combine some elements of both. The Sigma offered a very nice build quality and very good focus quality, smoother and quieter than what this lens is. However, this lens, I vastly prefer the image quality from it. And so you're kind of, stuck. It also, I prefer the price point that they came to market in. I think that's a fair price. And I suspect that there are a lot of people that'll be really glad to have this as an option. And obviously you have two other basic alternatives, really. You have one from Samyang, which, a lot of people, I haven't tested it myself, but a lot of people reported that the image quality is not as good as this. You also, of course, have a G Master option, and along with a Sigma 24mm f1.4 Art. Those last two are obviously much larger, particularly the Sigma lens, and so and at a very, very different price point. You can buy 4 of these basically for the price of the G Master lens, and so not everybody has that kind of budget, and so I suspect that there is room for a less expensive and yet optically strong little prime lens. And if you can deal with some of the quirks I've detailed when it comes to the autofocus, then I think you'll be perfectly happy. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review. You can find details there going to the image gallery, and so you can take a look at more photos, see if you like what you see. There are also buying links there if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. There's also linkage to follow me on social media, to become a patron, to sign up for my newsletter, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.